powerful judge tried to destroy a humble maid's life. But he never imagined her quiet, 17-year-old daughter would turn his courtroom into her battlefield. When Judge Wallace Thompson summoned Carol Peterson to his courtroom that morning, he thought it would be simple, a quick conviction, a quiet humiliation. Just another lesson from a man who believed power was justice. People like you, he told her once, should remember their place. What he didn't know was that Carol's 17-year-old daughter had been listening, watching, planning. Behind her calm eyes was a mind sharper than any lawyer's brief, and a legacy forged by a soldier who'd once fought not just for freedom, but for truth itself. What started as a petty act of revenge became a war for integrity, legacy, and survival. This is the story of how a humble maid and her brilliant daughter turned the law itself against the man who thought he owned it. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A powerful man thought he could crush a humble woman with the weight of the law. He planned to ruin her for a simple mistake, to make an example of her quiet dignity. What he didn't know was that her 17-year-old daughter was about to become his worst nightmare. Carol Peterson believed in a simple creed: work hard, be honest, and never cause trouble. For 15 years, she had lived by those words. Her hands, though chapped and weary, were a testament to her dedication. She cleaned the homes of the city's wealthiest families. She scrubbed their floors, polished their silver, and washed away the traces of lives she could only imagine. It was difficult work, but it was honest. And it paid for the small, two-bedroom apartment she shared with her daughter, Abigail. Her days started before the sun rose. She would move through the quiet apartment, her footsteps soft on the worn linoleum floor. She'd pack a lunch for Abigail, always leaving a small, handwritten note tucked inside. Then, she would catch the 6 a.m. bus, her cleaning supplies rattling gently in her tote bag. Her last stop of the day was always the grandest, the home of Judge Wallace Thompson. The judge's house wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of ambition. It stood on a hill overlooking the town, a monument of brick and marble. Inside, dark mahogany furniture gleamed under the light of crystal chandeliers. The walls were covered in framed degrees and photos of the judge shaking hands with important men. Carol felt small in that house. She moved through its silent, imposing rooms like a ghost. Her presence meant to be felt only in the results of her work: the dust-free shelves, the gleaming windows, the spotless floors. Judge Thompson himself rarely acknowledged her. He was a man carved from granite, with a stern face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He moved with an air of absolute authority, both in his home and, as Carol had heard, in his courtroom. He expected perfection, and Carol always delivered it. She was careful, methodical, and invisible. That was the key to keeping a job like this. One Tuesday afternoon, however, the routine was broken. Carol was in the judge's study, a room that always made her uneasy. It smelled of old leather and power. Books with serious, golden titles lined the walls from floor to ceiling. She was dusting the massive oak desk, her movements precise and practiced. As she reached to wipe down the telephone, she accidentally knocked a heavy silver pen holder. It rolled off the desk and fell to the floor, striking a small, hidden button on a power strip tucked beneath the desk. With a soft whirring sound, a speakerphone on the desk activated. A man's voice, tinny and agitated, filled the silent room. "Wallace, you can't be serious," the voice said. "The zoning commission will never approve it. It's a clear conflict of interest, and the Peterson family has owned that land for 3 generations. Carol froze, her hand still outstretched. She shouldn't be hearing this. She knew she should turn it off, leave the room, pretend nothing had happened. But her feet felt bolted to the floor. Judge Thompson's voice, smooth and cold as steel, replied through the speaker. "The commission will approve whatever I tell them to approve. I've already spoken to Henderson. As for the Petersons, they'll be compensated fairly. Consider it an eminent domain issue for a vital city project." "A luxury condo development is not a vital city project," the other man argued, his voice rising. "This is about your investment partners, nothing more. You're using your position to force an old man off his property." "My position," the judge said slowly, his tone dripping with menace, is what allows me to make the difficult decisions this town needs. The Peterson farm is standing in the way of progress. He can take the buyout, or I can find a dozen health and safety violations that will condemn the property by Friday. The choice is his. There was a click, and the line went dead. Carol's heart was pounding in her chest. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She quickly reached down, her hands trembling, and unplugged the entire power strip. The study fell back into its heavy silence. She finished her work in a blur of anxiety, her mind replaying the conversation over and over. She knew the Peterson family. Old Mr. Peterson sold vegetables at the farmer's market. His farm had been his life. The thought of him being pushed out by a man like Judge Thompson made her feel sick. As she was packing her things to leave, the judge returned home early. He strode into the study, his briefcase slapping against his leg. He stopped just inside the doorway, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Carol's back was to him, but she could feel his gaze on her. "Is everything finished in here?" he asked. His voice was no longer smooth. It was clipped and suspicious. "Yes, Judge. I was just leaving," Carol said, turning around slowly. She tried to keep her face neutral, to betray none of the fear and disgust churning inside her. His eyes narrowed, lingering on the desk, then on the power strip on the floor, which was now visibly unplugged from the wall socket. A dark cloud passed over his face. He didn't say another word about it. He simply gave her a long, cold look. It was a look that said, "I know you heard." Carol mumbled a quiet goodbye and hurried out of the house, her heart thumping against her ribs. She didn't look back. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had made a powerful enemy. She had seen behind the curtain, and Judge Wallace Thompson was not a man who tolerated witnesses. That evening, the small apartment felt like a sanctuary. The smell of her daughter's studying, old books, and brewing tea was a comfort. Abigail, or Abby as everyone called her, was sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of textbooks. At 17, she was the center of Carol's world. She had her father's kind eyes and a cascade of blonde hair that fell over her shoulders as she worked. But her mind was all her own. Abby was brilliant. It wasn't just that she got good grades. She consumed knowledge with a hunger that amazed her teachers. She read history books for fun. She taught herself advanced mathematics from library textbooks. Her mind was a finely tuned engine, constantly analyzing, questioning, and connecting ideas. "Tough day, Mom?" Abby asked, looking up from her calculus homework. She could always read her mother's moods. Carol forced a smile. "Just a little tired, honey." She didn't want to worry her daughter with the judge's affairs. It was adult business, dangerous business. She would just be more careful. She would keep her head down and hope the judge forgot all about her. But Judge Thompson was not a man who forgot. He was a man who planned. He believed the world was divided into the powerful and the weak, the hammers and the nails. And this simple-minded cleaning lady, this nobody who had accidentally stumbled upon his private dealings, was a nail that needed to be hammered down. He couldn't fire her outright. That might look suspicious. No, it had to be something else. Something that would not only remove her, but also serve as a lesson. It had to be legal. It had to be official. It had to be completely deniable. 2 weeks passed. The tension in the judge's house was thick enough to cut with a knife. He was never there when Carol cleaned, but she felt his presence everywhere. It was in the way objects on his desk seemed to have been moved and then put back, as if he were searching for something. It was in the cold, formal notes left with her pay, a change from the simple check that used to be left on the counter. She was being watched. Then, the letter arrived. It was a plain white envelope from the city municipal court. Carol's hands shook as she opened it. The document inside was filled with dense, official language. But she made out the important words, "Summons to appear." According to the notice, she was being cited for improper disposal of waste, a violation of a city ordinance she had never even heard of. It claimed that on a specific date 2 months ago, she had left trash bags on a public sidewalk. Carol sank into a chair, bewildered. "I don't understand," she whispered to herself. She was meticulous about trash. She always used the large bins behind the houses she cleaned, just as she'd been instructed. She had never left a bag on a sidewalk in her life. The summons ordered her to appear in court in 1 week. The presiding judge, it noted at the bottom of the page, would be the Honorable Wallace Thompson. A cold dread washed over her. This was his doing. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but how could she prove it? It was her word against the official stamp of the court. Her word against a judge. She felt a wave of helplessness. He was going to ruin her. He was going to drag her name through the mud, make her pay fines she couldn't afford, and likely get her fired. Who would want to hire a maid with a criminal record, no matter how minor? That night, she couldn't hide her distress from Abby. She sat at the kitchen table, the summons lying in front of her like a death sentence, and explained what had happened. She left out the part about the phone call. She didn't want Abby to know the true depth of the judge's corruption. She framed it as a terrible, inexplicable mistake. Abby listened patiently, her expression growing more serious with every word. She picked up the summons, her eyes scanning the document with an intensity that seemed beyond her years. She wasn't just reading the words, she was dissecting them. Improper disposal of waste, Ordinance 214, B. Abby murmured, her finger tracing the line. They list the address as 1414 Oakhaven Drive. Isn't that Judge Thompson's house? Yes, Carol said, her voice trembling. But Abby, I didn't do it. I never would. I know you didn't, Mom, Abby said, her voice calm and steady. It was a strange and sudden reversal of roles. The daughter was now comforting the mother. This doesn't feel like a mistake. This feels intentional. She stood up and walked to the small, crowded bookshelf in their living room. It was mostly filled with Abby's schoolbooks and old paperbacks. But on the bottom shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust, was a row of heavy, leather-bound books. They had belonged to Carol's grandfather, Abby's great-grandfather, Sergeant Michael Iron Mike Riley. Sergeant Riley was a local legend. He had been a hero in the war, a man known for his unshakable courage. But after the war, he had come home and used the GI Bill to put himself through law school. He never became a rich or famous lawyer. Instead, he had been a small-town attorney, a defender of the common man. He spent his life fighting for people like Old Man Peterson, people who were being pushed around by money and power. He had passed away years ago, but he had left behind his most prized possessions, his law library and his journals. Abby had started reading them when she was 12. At first, it was out of curiosity. Then, it became a fascination. She read about legal principles, courtroom procedures, and the moral codes that were supposed to govern the law. She absorbed it all. She understood the intricate dance of motions and objections, the weight of precedent, and the precise language of statutes. She understood it better than most first-year law students. It was her secret world, a place her mind went when the dramas of high school felt small and meaningless. She pulled one of the heavy books from the shelf. Its title was embossed in faded gold, A Citizen's Guide to Municipal Law. She flipped it open on the table next to the summons. "Don't worry, Mom," Abby said, her eyes alight with a fire Carol had never seen before. "He thinks he's cornered a frightened mouse." She looked up at her mother, her expression one of pure, unyielding resolve. "He has no idea he's about to step on a tiger trap." Judge Wallace Thompson sat in his chambers, the picture of judicial authority. The room was his sanctuary, a space designed to intimidate. Sunlight struggled to get through the tall, narrow windows, leaving the corners of the room in perpetual shadow. The scent of old paper and furniture polish hung in the air. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. He was reviewing the docket for the upcoming week. When he came to case number MC 2025-784, City versus Peterson, Carol, he paused. A simple ordinance violation. A $50 fine. It was nothing. But to him, it was everything. It was the first move in a game only he was supposed to understand. His clerk, a timid man named Arthur Finch, knocked softly before entering. Mr. Finch had worked for Judge Thompson for 10 years. He was a man who had long ago traded his spine for a steady paycheck. He knew when the judge was on the warpath. The summons for the Peterson woman was delivered, Your Honor, Finch said, avoiding the judge's eyes. Good, Thompson replied, not looking up from his papers. She is scheduled for next Tuesday. Your Honor, Finch began, hesitating for a moment. I couldn't help but notice. The citation was issued by Officer Miller. He normally works traffic duty on the other side of town. It's a little unusual for him to be writing up a sanitation code violation on Oakhaven. Thompson finally looked up, his gaze sharp enough to make Finch flinch. Are you questioning the validity of an officer's citation, Mr. Finch? No, of course not, Your Honor. It's Carol Peterson. She cleans my cousin's house. She's been doing it for years. She's the most honest, meticulous person you could imagine. It just seems out of character." The judge leaned back in his large leather chair, steepling his fingers under his chin. He enjoyed these little moments, these opportunities to remind his subordinates of their place. People are not always what they seem, Arthur. Perhaps this woman's meticulous nature is a facade. Or perhaps she simply made a mistake. The law, as you know, is indifferent to character. It concerns itself only with facts. And the fact is, a citation was issued. Finch nodded nervously. He knew better than to push. He knew the judge held grudges. He had seen what happened to a court stenographer who had once corrected the judge's grammar in an open courtroom. She had been transferred to the basement archives a week later. "Of course, Your Honor," Finch muttered, backing out of the room. The judge's smile returned as soon as the door clicked shut. It was all so easy. He had called in a small favor from a police sergeant who owed him one. A compliant officer was dispatched to write a bogus ticket, dated retroactively. It was a flimsy charge, but it didn't need to be strong. Its only purpose was to get Carol Peterson into his courtroom, into his world, where he made the rules. He would find her guilty, levy a small fine, and then make a quiet phone call to the agency that handled her cleaning placements. He would express his disappointment in hiring an employee with a criminal record. She would be fired, ruined, all without anyone ever connecting it back to him. It was a clean, elegant solution. Meanwhile, in the Peterson apartment, an entirely different kind of planning was underway. For 3 straight nights, Abby barely slept. She surrounded herself with her great-grandfather's books. She cross-referenced the city ordinance in the summons with state-level statutes. She read about the rules of evidence, the standards for issuing a citation, and the procedural requirements for a municipal court hearing. Carol watched her, a mixture of pride and terror welling up inside her. Her daughter, her brilliant, quiet daughter, was transforming before her eyes. She moved with a purpose that was daunting. She spoke about legal concepts as if they were old friends. "They didn't follow procedure, Mom," Abby announced on the 3rd night, looking up from a thick, dusty volume titled Principles of Administrative Law. "What do you mean, honey?" Carol asked, placing a cup of tea on the one clear corner of the table. "An ordinance violation like this requires the citing officer to have witnessed the infraction personally," Abby explained, her voice clear and confident. "Or, they need a signed complaint from a citizen who did witness it. The summons doesn't mention a complainant. It just says the citation was issued. That's the first weakness." She pulled out a notebook where she had been scribbling notes. "Second, the citation has to be delivered to you in person or by certified mail if it's not issued on the spot. This was just sent by regular mail. That's a procedural error. It means the court might not have proper jurisdiction." Carol stared at her, mystified. "How do you know all this, Abby?" Abby tapped the cover of the book in front of her. "Great-Grandpa Mike taught me," she said with a small smile. "He wrote notes in the margins of all his books. It's like he's still here, explaining it all." She pointed to a handwritten scrawl next to a dense paragraph. It read, "Procedure is the bedrock. They can have all the power in the world, but if they don't follow the rules, their case is built on sand." A flicker of hope ignited in Carol's chest. For the first time since the summons arrived, she felt that she wasn't completely helpless. "So what do we do?" she asked. "We don't challenge the facts yet," Abby said, her mind clearly several steps ahead. "If you go in there and just say, 'I didn't do it,' it's your word against an officer's. The judge will shut you down immediately. We need to challenge the process. We need to show that the case itself is invalid before it even begins." Abby spent the next few days preparing. She wrote out a clear, simple statement for her mother to read. It was polite, respectful, but firm. It raised questions about the lack of a named complainant and the improper service of the summons. She made 3 copies, one for her mother, one for the court clerk, and one for the city prosecutor. She also made a phone call. She looked up the number for the city's sanitation department. Posing as a student working on a civics project, she asked a friendly supervisor a series of innocent questions. "Could you tell me how your department handles complaints about improperly disposed trash?" she asked. The supervisor explained the process. A complaint is logged, a sanitation officer is dispatched to verify it, and only then is a citation issued, usually after a warning. So, a police officer from the traffic division wouldn't just write a ticket for that. Abby asked sweetly, "A traffic cop?" The man laughed. Heavens, no. They wouldn't even know what ordinance to cite. That's all handled by our department or code enforcement. Why do you ask? Just curious about how the different city departments work together, Abby said smoothly. Thank you. You've been very helpful. She hung up the phone, a grimly satisfied look on her face. She had her third point of attack. The citation wasn't just procedurally flawed, it was jurisdictionally questionable. The day of the court hearing arrived like a storm cloud. Carol felt sick to her stomach. She wore her best church dress, a simple navy blue outfit that made her feel plain and insignificant. Abby stood beside her, wearing a simple gray sweater. She looked like any other teenager, but her eyes were sharp and focused. She carried a thin leather satchel that had belonged to her great-grandfather. Inside were her notes, the copies of the statement, and a small, worn copy of the U.S. Constitution. The municipal courthouse was a noisy, chaotic place. People rushed back and forth, their faces etched with anxiety. Carol and Abby sat on a hard wooden bench, waiting for their turn. Carol's hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. Just breathe, Mom, Abby whispered, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. Remember what we practiced. Stick to the script. Don't get emotional. Just state the facts of the process. When the clerk finally called Carol's name, her legs felt like jelly. She walked toward the defendant's table, Abby a few steps behind her. They sat down, and Carol looked up at the judge's bench. Judge Thompson was already there, staring down at her. His face was a mask of cold indifference, but Carol could see a flicker of triumph in his eyes. He had her right where he wanted her. Case MC 2025-784, City v. Peterson, the judge announced, his voice booming through the courtroom. Charge is violation of Ordinance 214. B. Improper disposal of waste. How do you plead, Miss Peterson? Carol's throat was dry. She took a deep breath, clutching the paper Abby had prepared for her. Your Honor, she began, her voice shaking slightly. Before I enter a plea, I would like to raise a procedural question for the record. Judge Thompson's eyebrow went up. This was not the response he expected from a meek, uneducated cleaning woman. He expected a tearful denial or a quick, mumbled plea of guilty. A procedural question? He asked, his tone laced with condescension. Ms. Peterson, this is a simple citation hearing, not a federal trial. The procedure is that you plead guilty or not guilty. With all due respect, Your Honor, Carol continued, her voice gaining a little strength as she read from Abby's script. I believe there are foundational issues with the summons itself that need to be addressed. A low murmur went through the small audience in the courtroom. The city prosecutor, a young, overworked man, looked up from his crossword puzzle with a flash of annoyance. The judge's expression soured. And what might those foundational issues be? He sneered. Carol took another breath. This was it. First, Your Honor, I would like to formally request a copy of the sworn complaint that led to this citation. Municipal Court Rule 4A states that a summons of this nature must be based on a complaint made under oath. The summons I received does not reference such a complaint. The judge was momentarily stunned into silence. He stared at the woman. The words were hers, but the language, the precision, the citation of a specific court rule, that was something else entirely. He shot a glare at the city prosecutor, who quickly began fumbling through the thin file. Well, the judge barked at the prosecutor. The young man stood up, his face flushed. Your Honor, the file just contains the citation itself, issued by Officer Miller. There is no separate civilian complaint. The judge's jaw tightened. This was a minor setback, easily dismissed. The sworn statement of the officer who witnessed the event serves as the complaint, Ms. Peterson. That is standard procedure. I understand, Your Honor, Carol said, moving to the next point on her script. In that case, I must raise a second issue. The summons was delivered via standard mail. Court Rule 4D requires that a summons be served in person by an officer of the court, or sent via certified mail with a return receipt requested. As the court cannot produce a signed receipt, I believe service was improper, and therefore, this court lacks personal jurisdiction over me in this matter. The courtroom was now completely silent. Every eye was on Carol. The prosecutor's jaw was hanging slightly open. He had never heard a defendant in traffic court argue jurisdiction. Judge Thompson's face was turning a dangerous shade of red. The simple-minded Maid was not following his script. She was quoting his own court's rules back to him. He slammed his hand on the desk, not with the gavel, but with his open palm. The sound echoed through the room. "Miss Peterson, I am growing tired of these games," he snarled. "You seem to have gotten some advice from a courthouse lawyer. Let me assure you, these minor technicalities will not help you. Now, for the last time, how do you plead?" Carol's courage was faltering under his glare. She looked at Abby, who gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was time for the final point. "Your Honor," Carol said, her voice now steady and clear. "My final point is not a technicality. The citation was written by a traffic officer. I have spoken with the sanitation department, and they have confirmed that enforcement of Ordinance 214 falls exclusively under their jurisdiction or that of code enforcement. Therefore, the citation appears to be invalid, as it was issued by an officer who lacked the proper authority." She paused, then delivered the final line Abby had written for her. "Given these three significant procedural and jurisdictional errors, I move for a dismissal of the charge." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. A cleaning woman, with no lawyer, had just stood up to Judge Thompson and methodically dismantled the case against her before it had even started. Judge Thompson stared at her, his face a thunderous mask of fury. His neat, elegant plan was in shambles. He had wanted to make her look foolish, to crush her quietly. Instead, she had made him and the city prosecutor look incompetent. He had underestimated her. No, he had underestimated whoever was feeding her these lines. His eyes flickered to the blonde-haired girl sitting beside her, the one who had been watching him with an unnerving, analytical calm. This was no longer about a quiet act of revenge. This had become a public challenge to his authority, and Judge Wallace Thompson would not be challenged. "Motion denied," he boomed, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "We will proceed. Since you seem so eager to contest this, we will set a date for a full trial." "And Ms. Peterson," he said, leaning forward and pointing a finger at her, "I would advise you to think very carefully about your next steps. Wasting this court's time has consequences." He banged his gavel, his eyes promising a war. Carol felt a wave of despair. She had done everything right, and he had simply swatted it away. But as she turned to leave, she saw the look on Abby's face. It wasn't fear. It wasn't disappointment. It was the cool, calculating look of a strategist who had just seen her opponent's move and was already planning her counterattack. The judge had just escalated the fight, and Abby was more than ready for it. The walk home from the courthouse was heavy with a silence that felt louder than any words. Carol's brief flicker of hope had been extinguished by the judge's gavel. She felt as though she had walked into a steel trap, and in her attempt to escape, had only caused its jaws to clamp down harder. She clutched her purse, her knuckles white, replaying the judge's final, menacing words in her mind. "Wasting this court's time has consequences. I shouldn't have listened to you, Abby," she finally whispered, the words catching in her throat. "I should have just paid the $50. Now he's angry. He's going to make it worse." Abby stopped on the sidewalk, turning to face her mother. The afternoon sun caught in her blonde hair, creating a halo effect, but her expression was anything but angelic. It was fierce. "No, Mom," she said, her voice low and even. "Paying the fine would have been pleading guilty. You would have been admitting to something you didn't do. You would have a record. You would have let him win before the fight even started. We did the right thing." "The right thing." Carol's voice rose with a note of hysteria. "The right thing got me a trial. In his courtroom. With him as the judge. What kind of chance do I have?" "A better chance than you think," Abby insisted, her conviction unwavering. "He's angry because he's used to people being scared. He expected you to cry and apologize. When you stood up to him, you threw him off his game. He made a mistake today." "What mistake?" Carol asked, bewildered. "He denied everything and set a trial date. He showed his hand," Abby said, starting to walk again, her pace quickening with purpose. "He revealed that this isn't about a sanitation ticket anymore. It's personal. And when a judge makes things personal, he stops being a judge and starts being a bully. Bullies get sloppy." When they got back to the apartment, Abby went straight to the bookshelf. This time, she didn't pull down the books on municipal law. She went for the heavy, imposing volumes on legal ethics and judicial conduct. She opened a book and laid it flat on the kitchen table, the spine cracking in protest. For the next hour, she was silent, her eyes devouring the text, her mind a whirlwind of activity. Carol watched her from the living room couch. A knot of fear and pride tangled in her stomach. She was terrified for her daughter. Abby was just a child, a brilliant child, but a child nonetheless. She was taking on a powerful, ruthless man. Yet, seeing her daughter's intense focus, the way she navigated those complex legal texts as if they were simple novels, filled Carol with a sense of awe. It was as if her grandfather, Sergeant Mike, was in the room with them, guiding Abby's hand. Finally, Abby looked up, a new light in her eyes. "I have a plan," she said. The plan was audacious. It was risky, and it required Carol to place her complete and utter faith in her 17-year-old daughter. "The first thing we need to do," Abby began, "is get him off the case. We need to file a motion for recusal." "A motion for what?" "To have the judge step down and let another judge take over," Abby explained. "We're going to argue that he has a clear and demonstrable bias against you, and therefore cannot provide a fair and impartial trial, which is your constitutional right." Carol shook her head. "He'll just deny it again. He'll say I'm wasting his time." "He might," Abby conceded. "But the motion itself is a weapon. We're not just filing it with the court, we're creating a record. The motion will detail everything that's happened, the suspicious nature of the citation, his aggressive behavior in the hearing, and his personal connection to the case as your employer. It puts him on notice. If he denies it and then rules against you in the trial, we have a clear basis for an appeal. We'll be building a case against him." Over the next week, their small apartment transformed into a legal war room. Abby spent hours at the public library, using their computers to look up case law, previous court decisions that supported their arguments. She found several cases where judges were recused for far less. She printed out articles, highlighted passages, and arranged them in neat piles on the floor. She also began drafting the motion. She used her great-grandfather's old legal dictionary to make sure every word was precise. Her handwriting, usually a graceful cursive, became a sharp, determined print. She laid out the argument in 3 sections. First, the personal relationship. She argued that Judge Thompson's position as Carol's employer created an inherent conflict of interest. How could he be an impartial arbiter of justice when he had a direct, personal, and financial relationship with the defendant? Second, his conduct in the initial hearing. She quoted his dismissive and threatening language verbatim, arguing that it demonstrated a clear prejudice against her mother before any evidence had been presented. She cited the canons of judicial ethics, which demanded that a judge act with patience, dignity, and courtesy. Third, the suspicious origins of the case itself. She hinted that the charge seemed less like a legitimate legal complaint and more like a targeted action, designed to harass and intimidate. She didn't have concrete proof of the judge's involvement in the ticket, but she could raise the question in a way that planted a seed of doubt. While Abby worked on the legal strategy, Carol had her own part to play. "Mom, I need you to think," Abby had said. "Has the judge ever done anything else? Said anything? That felt wrong." Carol, emboldened by her daughter's courage, finally told Abby about the phone call she had overheard. The conversation about the Peterson farm and the judge's plan to use his power to force an old man off his land. Abby's eyes widened as she listened. "That's it," she breathed. "That's the motive. This isn't just about you hearing something you shouldn't have. This is him trying to discredit a potential witness." She incorporated this new information into the motion, phrasing it carefully. She didn't accuse the judge of a crime directly. Instead, she stated that Carol had inadvertently become aware of sensitive information regarding the judge's private business dealings, and that the timing of the citation, just days later, was highly suspect. The day before the trial, Abby made another crucial move. She knew that a motion filed in a quiet courtroom could be easily buried. She needed a witness. She looked up the number for the local newspaper, the Oak Valley Chronicle. She asked to speak to the city desk and was put through to a reporter named Ben Carter. "My name is Abigail Peterson," she said, her voice steady and mature. "My mother, Carol Peterson, is a defendant in a case in Judge Thompson's court tomorrow. I believe there are some serious questions of judicial misconduct involved. It might be a story you're interested in." Ben Carter was a seasoned reporter who had covered the city courthouse for years. He was skeptical. He got a dozen calls a week from disgruntled defendants claiming a judge was biased. But there was something in the girl's voice, a seriousness, a command of the facts, that caught his attention. He agreed to be in the courtroom. The morning of the trial was even more tense than the first hearing. The room was fuller this time. Ben Carter sat in the back row, a notepad open on his lap. Judge Thompson swept into the room, his black robes flowing behind him like a cape. He looked even more severe, more imposing than before. He settled into his chair and glared down at Carol and Abby. "We are here to proceed with the trial of Ms. Carol Peterson," he began, his voice like gravel. "Is the defendant ready to proceed?" Carol's hand was shaking, but she stood up, holding the pages Abby had given her. "Your Honor, before the trial begins, I would like to file a formal motion for recusal." She walked forward and handed a copy to the clerk, who then passed it up to the judge. She handed another copy to the stunned city prosecutor. Judge Thompson took the document, his eyes scanning the first page. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch. He read on, his face growing darker with every paragraph. He saw the citation of his own court's rules, the quotes of his own words, the reference to his status as her employer, and finally, the veiled but unmistakable reference to the Peterson farm deal. He looked up, his eyes burning with a cold fire. He saw Abby watching him, her expression unreadable. He saw the reporter in the back of the room, scribbling furiously in his notepad. He was caught, not on the facts of the silly ticket, but on the appearance. The girl had boxed him in. If he denied the motion and convicted her mother, the reporter would have a field day with the story. Powerful judge with conflict of interest prosecutes his own maid. For a long minute, the judge said nothing. He sat there, the motion clutched in his hand, the silence in the courtroom thick with tension. He was a man who was used to absolute control, and for the second time, this teenage girl had seized it from him. He had two choices: plow ahead and risk a public scandal, or retreat, swallow his pride, and live to fight another day. He chose retreat, but he did it in a way that preserved a sliver of his authority. "The court has reviewed the defendant's motion," he said, his voice tight and strained. "While the court finds the claims of bias to be utterly without merit and, frankly, insulting, I am aware of the high standards to which a judge must be held." He paused, forcing the words out. "To avoid even the appearance of impropriety, I will grant the motion. I am recusing myself from this case." He glared at Carol. "The case will be rescheduled and heard by a different judge. This court is adjourned." He slammed the gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. He then stood and swept out of the courtroom through his private door without a backward glance. Carol felt a wave of relief, so powerful her knees went weak. She sank into her chair, her hand flying to her chest. "We did it," she whispered to Abby. "You did it. We won the battle," Abby said quietly, watching the door the judge had disappeared through. "But the war isn't over. All we did was make him angrier. And now, he knows who he's fighting." As they packed up their satchel, the reporter, Ben Carter, approached them. "That was the most remarkable thing I've ever seen in this courtroom," he said, looking at Abby with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. "I'm Ben Carter, from the Chronicle. Can I ask you a few questions?" Abby looked at her mom, who nodded her permission. "Okay," Abby said. "That motion was a brilliant piece of legal writing," Carter said. "Where did you go to law school?" Abby gave him a small, wry smile. "I'm a junior at Northwood High. I just read a lot." Carter's jaw dropped. He looked from Abby to her mother and back again. "A high school junior did this?" He shook his head in amazement. "This is a much bigger story than I thought." He asked them about the case, and Abby explained the procedural errors and the conflict of interest, sticking to the facts and avoiding any emotional language. But when Carter asked about the reference to the judge's private business dealings, Abby held back. "We can't comment on that part," she said firmly. "It's not relevant to my mother's case anymore." She knew that revealing the details about the Peterson farm deal now would be a mistake. It was her ace in the hole, a piece of information too valuable to give away to a newspaper. It was leverage. The next day, a small article appeared on the front page of the Chronicle's local section. The headline read, "Judge recuses himself in Maid's case amidst bias claims." The article was carefully written, but the implication was clear. Judge Thompson had been forced to step down from a case against his own cleaning lady because of his questionable conduct. For Judge Thompson, the article was a public humiliation. He sat in his study, the newspaper spread out on his desk, his hands clenched into fists. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, not by a high-powered lawyer, but by a teenage girl with a library card. His quiet, elegant plan to ruin Carol Peterson had blown up in his face. It had turned into a public spectacle that threatened his reputation. The girl, Abigail, was the source of the problem. She was clever, she was resourceful, and she was a threat. He picked up the phone. His first call was to the police sergeant, who owed him a favor. "I need you to find out everything you can about a 17-year-old girl named Abigail Peterson," the judge said, his voice cold as ice. "Schools, friends, grades, any trouble she's ever been in. I want to know where she eats lunch. I want to know who she talks to. Dig. And be discreet." His second call was to a man he knew from an old, unsavory real estate deal, a private investigator named Silas Croft. Croft was a man who specialized in finding dirt. He was expensive, but he was thorough. "Silas," the judge said, "I have a new target for you. A mother and a daughter. Their names are Carol and Abigail Peterson. I want you to watch them. I want to know their weaknesses. I want leverage. Find me something I can use to crush them. Something that will never lead back to me." Judge Thompson hung up the phone. He was done with clever legal tricks. The girl wanted to play hardball. She had no idea how dirty the game could get. He leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile forming on his face. The rule of law had failed him. It was time to write his own rules. The recusal was a victory, but it was a victory that brought no peace. The Peterson apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a fishbowl. A vague, unsettling feeling of being watched settled over Carol. She would see the same gray sedan parked down the street when she left for work in the morning, and still there when she returned in the evening. Coincidences, she told herself. But her heart knew better. Silas Croft was good at his job. He was a man who moved in the shadows, a ghost with a telephoto lens. To him, people were not souls. They were collections of habits, routines, and weaknesses. For a week, he observed Carol and Abigail Peterson. He documented their every move. Carol's bus route, the grocery store she shopped at, the small church she attended on Sundays, Abby's walk to and from school, the library where she spent her afternoons. His initial reports to Judge Thompson were disappointingly thin. "The subjects are clean," Croft had said over a burner phone. "The mother works, pays her bills, and goes home. The daughter studies. No boyfriends, no bad habits, not even a detention. They're boring. Boring people have secrets," the judge had retorted, his voice venomous with impatience. "Everyone has a pressure point. Find it. I want you to look into the girl's great-grandfather, Sergeant Michael Riley, the local war hero. See what you can find there. Heroes often have the darkest shadows." While Croft dug into the past, Abby was preparing for the future. She knew the fight had moved beyond the courtroom. The judge was no longer using the law as his weapon. He was using his power. And to fight power, she needed more than just legal theory. She needed information. Her great-grandfather's legacy was more than just his law books. In a dusty footlocker under her bed, Abby found his journals. They were dozens of small, leather-bound notebooks, filled with his spidery, precise handwriting. For years, she had thought they were just personal diaries. But as she began to read them, she realized they were a meticulous record of his life as a lawyer in Oak Valley. He wrote about his cases, his clients, and his opponents. And he wrote, extensively, about the subtle corruption that ran like a poison beneath the town's placid surface. He documented backroom deals, handshake agreements that bent the law, and the quiet ways in which the wealthy and powerful looked out for one another. And a name that came up again and again, even 30 years ago, was Thompson. Not Judge Wallace Thompson, but his father, Wallace Thompson Sr., a ruthless real estate developer. Abby read about how the elder Thompson had used legal loopholes and political connections to acquire land for a pittance, pushing out small farmers and family businesses. Sergeant Mike had fought him on several occasions, winning some battles, losing others. He described the Thompsons, father and son, as men who saw the law not as a shield for the innocent, but as a hammer to build their own empire. While he has his father's ambition, Mike had written in an entry dated 1995, shortly after Wallace Jr. was first appointed as a junior judge. But he lacks his father's charisma. He is a colder, more brittle man. He craves respect more than money, and he will crush anyone who denies him it. He is a man to be watched. Reading her great-grandfather's words felt like receiving a message from a ghost. He was warning her, teaching her, from across the decades. He was showing her the enemy. The notice for the new trial date arrived. The case had been assigned to Judge Esther Friedman. Abby immediately went to the library and spent an evening reading about her. Judge Friedman was the opposite of Judge Thompson. She was a former public defender, known for her sharp mind, her no-nonsense demeanor, and her fierce adherence to the letter of the law. She was fair, but she had little patience for theatrics or frivolous arguments. Abby knew she couldn't rely on the same procedural challenges. With Judge Friedman, the case would be about the facts. And the only fact they had was a police officer's citation. "We need to discredit the officer," Abby told her mother. "We need to prove he wasn't there, or that he had a reason to lie." That was when the judge's shadow war began to touch them directly. One afternoon, Carol received a call from Mrs. Gable, one of her oldest clients. Her voice was strained and apologetic. "Carol, I'm so sorry," she said. "I'm going to have to let you go. My husband's firm, they do some business with the city. We were just advised that it would be better if we made a change." Carol hung up the phone, her hand trembling. She knew, with absolute certainty, that Judge Thompson was behind it. He was methodically cutting off her income, trying to starve her into submission. 2 days later, another client canceled. The financial pressure was immense. They were already living on a tight budget. With half of her income gone, Carol started to panic. She began looking at the want ads, her face etched with worry. "We'll be okay, Mom," Abby said, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "This is just to scare you, to make you give up before the trial." But the judge's attacks grew more personal. One evening, as Abby was walking home from the library, the gray sedan pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, and a man she had never seen before, Silas Croft, leaned over. He wasn't physically threatening. He smiled, a greasy, unpleasant smile. "Abigail Peterson?" he asked. "Clever girl. Your mom must be proud." He let the words hang in the air. "A lot of people are talking about you. Your teachers, your friends. It's a shame when a young person's bright future gets complicated." He then held up a small photograph. It was a picture of her great-grandfather, Sergeant Mike, in uniform. "War heroes are complicated, too," Croft said, his smile widening. "People think they know the whole story. They rarely do." He rolled up the window and drove away, leaving Abby standing on the sidewalk, her blood running cold. It was a clear, unmistakable threat. He wasn't just watching her. He was digging into her family's past, looking for a secret he could use as a weapon. That night, Abby couldn't sleep. The man's words echoed in her head. Heroes often have the darkest shadows. What did he mean? She had always idolized her great-grandfather. He was a symbol of integrity, of justice. The idea that there was some hidden stain on his legacy was terrifying. Fueled by a new sense of urgency, she returned to his journals, this time searching for anything personal, anything that might be used against him. She read late into the night, the only light in the apartment coming from the small lamp on the kitchen table. And then she found it. It was a small, separate notebook tucked into the back of the footlocker, one she had never seen before. It wasn't about the law. It was a personal diary from his time in the war. She read about the horrors of combat, the fear, the loss of his friends. And then she read the entry that made her stop breathing. He wrote about a single, terrible incident. A moment of chaos during a brutal firefight. A young, terrified private had frozen under enemy fire, endangering the entire platoon. In the smoke and confusion, a stray bullet had struck and killed the private. An officer, looking for a scapegoat, had accused Mike of firing the shot, of killing one of his own men. An official inquiry was launched. Mike swore it wasn't him. He described the chaos, the impossibility of knowing where any single shot came from. The inquiry, lacking conclusive evidence, officially cleared him. But a shadow of suspicion remained. He had been cleared, but he had not been fully exonerated in the eyes of some. He had carried that burden, that whisper of doubt, for the rest of his life. "They cleared my name, but the stain remains," he wrote. "It is a wound that does not heal. The truth is, in that hell, I don't know who fired what. I only know I did not intentionally harm a brother in arms. But the accusation itself is a ghost that will follow me to my grave. I pray it never touches my family." Abby closed the diary, her heart aching for the man she had never met. This was it. This was the dirt the judge's investigator was looking for. They would twist this story. They would leak it to the press. They would turn a war hero into a monster, all to discredit a teenage girl who was defending her mother from a bogus $50 fine. She felt a surge of rage, cold and pure. Judge Thompson had made a catastrophic mistake. He thought he was digging up a secret that would shame her family. But what he had really done was give Abby her most powerful weapon. He had made the fight personal for her great-grandfather, too. She now knew she wasn't just fighting for her mother anymore. She was fighting to protect the honor of Sergeant Michael "Iron Mike" Riley. She stood up and walked to the small bookshelf. She pulled down her great-grandfather's copy of the United States Constitution. She opened it to the Sixth Amendment, the right to a fair trial. The judge had tried to use his power to deny her mother that right. He had used intimidation. He had used financial pressure. And now he was using the ghost of a dead soldier to threaten a child. Abby looked at the journal, at the law books, at the photo of her great-grandfather on the mantelpiece. The fear she had felt was gone, replaced by an icy resolve. The judge thought he was in a war for his reputation. He was about to find out he was in a war for his soul, against a girl who was armed with the truth, and who had a legend watching her back. She now had the motive, the means, and the moral fury to not just win the case, but to tear down his entire corrupt world. The new courtroom was smaller, run by a woman who commanded respect without needing shadowy lighting to do it. Judge Esther Friedman peered down from the bench, her gaze missing nothing. She had already read the recusal motion against Judge Thompson, and her expression suggested she was not impressed. The city sent a senior prosecutor, David Chun, who called his only witness, Officer Miller. The officer recited his testimony in a flat monotone. Yes, on the date in question, he had observed a woman matching Carol's description leaving trash bags on the sidewalk. Yes, he was certain. It was a simple, direct accusation. Carol's heart sank. It was her word against a uniform. Does the defendant wish to cross-examine? Judge Friedman asked. Carol looked at Abby, her eyes wide with fear. Abby gave her hand a reassuring squeeze and then stood, walking to the lectern. Miss Peterson, the judge said, a hint of curiosity in her voice. Are you sure you wish to conduct this yourself? I am, Your Honor, Abby replied, her voice clear. My mother cannot afford an attorney. She turned to Officer Miller. Officer, you testified you were on Oakhaven Drive, a quiet residential street, far from your usual traffic post on the east side of town. Is that correct? We can be assigned anywhere, he grunted. And you are familiar with Judge Wallace Thompson? The officer's eyes flickered. He's a judge. Did he call you and ask you to write a fake ticket for his cleaning lady to silence her? Abby pressed, her voice hardening. Objection, Chin called out. Relevance. I will allow it, Judge Friedman said. Answer the question, officer. Miller licked his lips. I don't recall. Then you won't object to this court pulling your patrol car's GPS data for that night? Abby fired back. To prove you were actually there? The officer stared, his jaw working but no sound coming out. He knew, and Abby knew, he had been nowhere near that street. He had written the ticket at home. His bravado crumbled. Suddenly, a commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. The doors swung open and Judge Thompson strode in, his face a mask of incandescent rage, followed by Silas Croft, the private investigator, holding a manila envelope. This farce has gone on long enough, Thompson boomed, pointing a finger at Abby. This is a mockery of my courtroom. Judge Friedman banged her gavel. Judge Thompson, you are out of order. You have no standing here. Control yourself, or I will have you removed. I have every right, he bellowed. This is a slanderous attack on my character, and I have proof of the kind of family she comes from. He snatched the envelope from Croft and threw it onto the prosecutor's table. Read that. Read what her sainted great-grandfather, Sergeant Michael Riley, really was. Accused of shooting one of his own men in the back. That's her legacy. A family of cowards and liars. The courtroom erupted into shocked murmurs. Carol gasped. Abby, however, stood perfectly still. She didn't look hurt. She looked ready. She turned away from the crumbling Officer Miller and faced Judge Thompson. Thank you, Judge, she said, her voice cutting through the noise with chilling calm. Thank you for proving my case. She turned to Judge Friedman. Your Honor, for weeks, this man has systematically tried to ruin my mother. He had her fired from her jobs. He hired a private investigator to follow a minor. And now he has come into a court of law to slander a dead war hero to win a case over a $50 fine. This isn't about justice. It's about a powerful man's wounded pride. She walked to the prosecutor's table and picked up the file. She held up a faded military document. Yes, My great-grandfather was accused, Abby said, her voice filling the silent room. He was also investigated, and he was officially cleared. The man who accused him was later court-martialed for selling medical supplies on the black market. My great-grandfather spent his life fighting bullies like you. She then addressed the judge. Your Honor, the state's only witness has been discredited. The citation was issued under false pretenses on the orders of a biased party. We rest our case. Judge Friedman stared at the scene, her expression a mixture of astonishment and cold fury. She looked at the sweating Officer Miller. She looked at the unhinged Judge Thompson. Then she looked at the calm, fiercely intelligent young woman standing before her. This is the most egregious abuse of judicial power I have seen in my 20 years on the bench, Judge Friedman declared. The charges against Mrs. Peterson are dismissed with prejudice. Officer Miller, you are to report to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into perjury and official misconduct. She fixed her steely gaze on Wallace Thompson. As for you, Judge, your conduct is a disgrace. I am filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Commission and releasing the full transcript of these proceedings to the press. Now get out of my courtroom. Thompson stood frozen, his face ashen. He had lost, exposing himself completely. He stumbled out of the courtroom, a broken man. Outside, reporters swarmed them. Ben Carter pushed to the front. Abigail, a comment? Abby stood beside her mother, who was crying tears of relief. My mother is innocent. The system worked, she said simply. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a calculus test tomorrow. In the weeks that followed, the story exploded. Judge Thompson was suspended and ultimately disbarred. The crooked land deal collapsed under public scrutiny. Carol's clients rehired her, and Officer Miller was fired. One evening, a package arrived from the city's most prestigious law firm. Inside was a letter offering Abby a full scholarship to a pre-law program and a personal note. The world needs more lawyers like you. Your great-grandfather would be proud. Tucked inside was a framed photograph of Sergeant Mike, not in uniform, but in a lawyer's suit on the courthouse steps. Abby placed it on the mantelpiece. The soldier and the lawyer, two sides of the same coin. A man who fought for his country and then for its laws. Carol came and stood beside her. He's watching over you. Abby smiled, a deep, genuine smile. I know, she said, her fingers tracing the faded gold lettering on one of his law books. Justice runs in the family. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. We are always trying to improve our stories, so feel free to also drop your feedback in the comments section below. Thanks for spending this time with me.